welcome. The subject of whether Fantastic Four is based on or greatly influenced by the challengers of the unknown is a deep rabbit hole. There are a lot of theories and opinions regarding this topic, and there are some opinions that are, well, interesting conspiracy-styled theories that are as fictional as the two teams being discussed. First, let's look at the creation of the challengers of the unknown. It's universally accepted that Jack Kirby created the challengers. Certainly, he was heavily involved in their creation and shaped the team into its final published form. That is indisputable. But apparently, the writer, Dave Wood, was also involved. In the early Showcase Presents appearances, Dave Wood is officially recognized as the writer of the challengers. Presumably, DC has records showing payment to Wood for the comics in question, thus the writing credit. But what he contributed to the creation of the team is simply unknown. Dave Wood was, from what one can tell, a professional ghostwriter. He allegedly did a fair amount of work on Batman in the 50s. Apparently, he is the uncredited creator of Mr. Freeze. He also wrote the debut appearances of Dial H for Hero and Animal Man. Although it's uncertain what level of participation he had in those creations beyond writing the scripts. This is a point that applies to the challengers of the unknown. What, if anything, Wood contributed to the creation of this team is unclear. And at roughly the same time as the challengers were being created, Wood was also writing Kirby's syndicated newspaper strip, Skymasters of the Space Force. So a collaboration between Kirby and Wood on the challengers is quite possible. Furthermore, Joe Simon has claimed in recent years that the challengers were one of the final projects developed for Mainline Comics, the studio owned by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, before the studio was dissolved. When Mainline ended, all of the properties were split between Kirby and Simon, with Kirby ending up with the challengers. That being said, Simon's claim has little evidence to support it. However, the evidence supporting that claim is strictly circumstantial and anecdotal. Objectively speaking, who contributed what to the final challenger's product is ambiguous. Overall, the consensus opinion is that regardless of whether Joe Simon or Dave Wood contributed to the challengers of the unknown, it was Kirby who assembled all the elements together into the team that debuted in Showcase Presents number 6. Therefore, the universal acceptance of his status as creator is rather concrete. This conveniently brings us to the thread that ties the challengers and the Fantastic Four together. The common presumption made, when one argues that the Fantastic Four is based on Challengers of the Unknown, is that Kirby created both. More to the point, the Fantastic Four was a repurposed version of the Challengers, so to speak. Some suggest that Kirby merely rewrote the Challengers' stories, using similar villains and plots, with the Fantastic Four in the place of the Challengers. On the extreme end of this point, some contend that the Fantastic Four was a direct continuation of the Challengers. That is, where the Challengers end, the Fantastic Four begin, with the Challengers' characters assuming new Fantastic Four identities to disguise their past. Again, this is an extreme opinion, not the consensus. However, as previously discussed, Kirby's participation in the creation of the Fantastic Four was integral, but not absolute. It's a reasonable presumption that he plotted and drew the story with direction from Stan Lee. Lee then wrote the final dialogue, possibly incorporating suggestions from Kirby. The relevant point being, Lee had final say on the end product, and may have been responsible for shaping the characters into their known forms. While Kirby had absolute control over the challengers, putting aside any editorial input from DC, one can't suggest the same control applied to the Fantastic Four. Kirby was undeniably influential in plots and the overall direction of the Fantastic Four, but it may be a stretch to suggest this influence superseded Lee's editorial control. Moreover, there are examples of Kirby's Fantastic Four artwork where his dialogue suggestions added to the page margins are completely ignored by Stan Lee. Not a lot of Kirby's Marvel work survived the 60s. Most was stolen, given away, or otherwise destroyed, so it's difficult to know how common it was for Lee to ignore Kirby's suggestions. But it's reasonable to presume that Lee used what he wanted and discarded everything else. So suggesting that Kirby repurposed the challengers into the Fantastic Four doesn't seem very likely, at least not directly. Indirectly, by using some tropes common in his work, Kirby may have used elements from the challengers for the Fantastic Four. This is a distinct possibility, considering Kirby would recycle ideas and find new ways to explore a concept. Regardless, it needs to be reiterated, any conceptual recycling Kirby may have engaged in would have been subject to Stan Lee's editorial filter. Perhaps the key to unlocking this mystery is not by simply comparing the similarities between the two teams, but by also highlighting the differences. To begin with, each team has 4 members. Most suggest there are direct parallels between each member of the Fantastic Four with each member of the Challengers. These parallels are kind of soft, objectively speaking. The main reason for that is the Challengers don't have overly distinct personalities. Really, their defining trait is their specific field of specialty. At best you can say Professor Haley is the brains and Rocky Davis is the brawn, but Ace Morgan and Red Ryan are practically interchangeable, to be honest. Conversely, the members of the Fantastic Four are quite distinct. Reed is the highly intelligent leader, Ben is the kind-hearted tank, Johnny is the hot-headed teenager, Sue is, the woman. So while one could say Reed and Professor Haley and Ben and Rocky have similar roles, it's rather difficult to make a convincing argument that Ace and Red are parallels for Sue and Johnny. And quite honestly, a smart leader with a tough guy by his side is a pretty standard element for any team, so these two roles existing in both teams is not entirely unique. What is often overlooked is the fact that there was a 5th honorary member of the Challengers, June Robbins. Mind you, June was basically a standard damsel in distress, but she was originally introduced as a computer expert, and she did participate in a handful of Challengers' adventures. Admittedly, June appeared inconsistently, but she was considered part of the team. Another similarity between the two teams is they come together following an aeronautic disaster. The Challengers survive an airplane crash, and they take that as a sign they should all team up. The Fantastic Four survive a rocket crash and decide to do likewise. Again, there are differences that are overlooked. The Challengers are complete strangers that unite because of shared trauma. They unite for the sake of adventure. The Fantastic Four all know one another before the accident. They hop into space, get blasted by cosmic rays, and crash in a rocket. After the crash, they discover they have superpowers. They are motivated to stay together to make the world a better place. The basics of the origin are undeniably the same, but the details are vastly different. In other words, the similarity in origin for both teams is weak, but not non-existent. One issue that is usually mentioned in this regard is the Challengers of the Unknown number 3. In this issue, Rocky drinks an experimental chemical that will help astronauts survive the searing heat of re-entry. Rocky is shot into space, safely returns to Earth, and then discovers he has powers that are amazingly similar to the ones the Fantastic Four will acquire. Furthermore, this plot seems similar to the Fantastic Four's origin. Except, well, it isn't. While Rocky is shot into space, he doesn't get exposed to cosmic rays, nor does he crash land. His powers are temporary, and brought on by the experimental chemical he ingests. Rocky discovers he can shoot flames and ice from his hands. He's also able to grow in size, and he can camouflage himself to the point of invisibility. It needs to be mentioned that Rocky doesn't turn invisible like Sue Storm, he simply blends into the environment. Nor does Rocky stretch or contort himself like Reed Richards. He also doesn't burst into flame like Johnny. In fact, Rocky is taken down by a bullet that grazes his skull, so he's not exactly super strong and resilient like Ben Grimm. Again, any connection between this issue and the Fantastic Four's origin is very weak. Weak to the point of being coincidental. Overall, the Challengers' stories are weird, imaginative adventures with some science fiction elements. But they are basically adventure stories featuring monsters, magicians, and aliens as antagonists. The direction of the Fantastic Four wandered during the first 6 issues of the series. It tried a little bit of everything. Monsters, magicians, and aliens appeared in stories. Before the first year concluded, it settled into a melodramatic science fiction direction featuring antagonists with superhuman abilities. That being said, a lot of plots do seem similar between the two series, which may not be too surprising, since Jack Kirby essentially plotted and paced a story while he drew it. So it's possible, if not likely, he recycled older plots for the Fantastic Four. But whether this was a conscious decision, or one that occurred organically out of Kirby's comfortable familiarity with a plot that had previously worked, is unknown. Out of all the similarities that are usually discussed, the use of recycled plots seem to carry the most weight. Objectively speaking, if one is familiar with both comic books, it's hard not to notice many story ideas appear similar. The stories themselves are wildly different, generally speaking, but the basics are close. Naturally, one must ask, what did Jack Kirby think about this topic? Well, after many hours of searching through dozens of interviews, the answer seems to be very little. In fact, I could only find one instance of Kirby actually addressing the topic. This instance was the extensive interview he did with the Comics Journal in 1990, and Kirby acknowledges a vague connection, but doesn't elaborate whatsoever. He may have agreed with the premise, but he doesn't provide any information to confirm it. At that time, circa 1990, the idea that the Challengers were precursors to the Fantastic Four had become a known debatable topic. Who originated this connection is unknown, but it doesn't appear to be one that started with Kirby, as far as one can tell. In the end, the claim that the Fantastic Four were based on the Challengers of the Unknown is not a baseless claim in some respects. Overall, it may not be accurate to the point where one can form a convincing argument with solid, indisputable evidence. For the most part, these perceived similarities may be coincidental or an artifact of common tropes in Kirby's work. Recycling plots and, in some cases, antagonists is quite honestly not unknown in Jack Kirby's work. In my opinion, Kirby was conscious of what worked and what didn't, so he repeated elements that had been successful in the past. It's something any prolific artist or writer does intuitively to get the work done, and in Kirby's case, to get that work done on time. This isn't to suggest it's laziness or self-plagiarism on his part, it's simply a practical storytelling technique. So to answer the question, were the Challengers of the Unknown a first draft of the Fantastic Four? No, not really. There is some subtle commonality, but not enough to suggest a solid, direct link between the two. That's it for today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will talk at you later. Until next time.